Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be going into detail on Season 2's new Affix, Tormented, going fairly in depth about what it entails, giving you all of my thoughts on it, and discussing how it could change the meta moving into 9.1. We've had several weeks now to test this Affix over on the PTR, and we've learned a ton so far about various interactions and tricks you can use, but do know that this is subject to change before release, as we've seen multiple sets of major changes to the Affix from week to week. I won't be going into routes in this video, but over the next week or so I'll be putting out some basic general purpose routes for all 8 dungeons, as well as some more advanced routes for you guys to use. So be sure to subscribe to the channel to be notified when those videos get posted. With that said, let's just start off with what exactly this new seasonal affix is. Basically, there are 4 lieutenants of the jailer that have a set spawn location in each dungeon. Each of these lieutenants have their own unique abilities, as well as an aura that applies to all players when they're pulled. Killing a lieutenant causes it to drop an anima orb that players can interact with to gain a choice between 3 different powers, depending on both which boss you killed and what your own role is. These powers are permanent, lasting for the remainder of the dungeon, as opposed to Prideful, which only lasted for a minute after killing the mob. You can also choose to skip lieutenants entirely, in which case their unique auras will be applied to the last boss whenever you pull it. I think it's important to note, as of now, there's currently absolutely no randomness in this affix, which was something a lot of people were worried about early on. The same mini-bosses always spawn in the same spots within a dungeon, and they'll always drop the same powers for each role, and I'll go through all those later on in the video. Now, this is something that could change, as it's very possible there's some sort of rotation similar to like the Awakened affix, if you remember that back in BFA, but currently the only positioning changes we've seen on the beta seems to have been a rebalancing as opposed to an actual rotation change. In terms of general info, these mobs don't quite interact like normal trash in the dungeon, having a bunch of unique properties. Similar to Pridefuls from Season 1, these scale with key level and do not interact with any affixes aside from Grievous. None of them give trash count, and if you wipe while fighting them, their health will not reset, so you'll be able to finish them off easier after regrouping. The aggro radius on these mobs does appear to be slightly smaller than normal as well, though do note that they have true sight, so if you're expecting to be able to walk right by them with Shroud up, you're in for a bad time. Positioning of these mobs in several of the dungeons is a little bit awkward, but luckily they do not have social aggro, so if you have the range to tag some of these mobs over packs, you'll be able to pull them to a safer spot without worrying about adding more trash to the pull. They did appear to have a leash distance though, so you can't take them with you across half the dungeon, but they're also snappable, which is quite useful in a couple different situations. Getting into the lieutenants themselves, as I mentioned, there are 4 unique mini-bosses with their own abilities, auras, and anima power drops. First, we've got the fiery guy, Incinerator Arcalath, who is reminiscent of Prideful mobs, I would say, thanks to his aura, which deals party-wide fire damage every 3 seconds while you fight him. Unlike Prideful, this doesn't ramp up though, and remains consistent throughout the entire encounter. I am a little worried that this could get out of control with key level scaling similar to how Prideful's did, but the main upside is that you only need to fight him once as opposed to 4 to 5 times potentially throughout a dungeon, which makes it much more manageable. Aside from his aura, he'll intermittently apply a fire damage taken increase to 2 random players, which can be dispelled as it's a magic effect. He has a kickable party-wide fire damage hit, which you'll want to interrupt, and he'll shoot swirlies at random range players, which leaves an 8-yard puddle on the ground that you'll just have to avoid. These do time out after a few casts though, so you don't need a ton of space to handle this mechanic. Next up, we've got the icy guy, Oros Coldheart, who comes with a 50% slow aura. This can make dodging his other abilities a little bit challenging, so it's definitely beneficial to pre-spread a little bit when you're pulling this guy. In particular, this helps a lot with his random target frontal line attack, which you'll need to react quickly to if you want to dodge it. Aside from that, he'll occasionally spend a few seconds spawning a bunch of small swirlies that everyone will need to dodge, and will occasionally debuff a single player with a hard-hitting dot that splashes to nearby players, which is just another reason to be spread out. Immunities will also work on this if you have them, and it'll just completely make that ability disappear. From there, we've got the Tin Man, Sagadon the Breaker, whose aura increases both his own as well as nearby allies' physical damage done by 50%. If we're talking about lieutenants that might be skipped to save time, I think depending on the dungeon, this would be one of the easier last boss auras to deal with, as in the vast majority of dungeons, this pretty much only affects your tank. However, that also means you're going to be giving up one set of Anima Powers, which you may or may not want to do. In terms of abilities, he has a tank buster that will grip his current aggro target to him if they're out of range, so no kiting this one. He also does an AoE burst of physical damage to all party members and will occasionally grip all players to him, rooting them and spending 8 seconds channeling a big physical hit that will pretty much one-shot anyone that remains within 12 yards. You can either kill these roots, or you can use some sort of movement freeing effect, such as like Tiger's Lust, Freedom, those kinds of things. The roots themselves, they don't have a ton of health though, so with some well-timed AoE, you can just cleave them down and they'll be dead in a couple seconds. Last up, we have Executioner Varuth, who probably has the scariest aura of the four with a 50% healing reduction applied to all players. We also found the difficulty on this lieutenant to vary greatly, depending on where it's positioned in the dungeon. Thanks to his main ability where he selects a random player, then after a few seconds, charges to their location and applies a hefty bleed to them and nearby allies. There's a couple interesting things to note with this ability. Most importantly though, it can be LOS to interrupt the cast. If this happens, he'll either try and select a new target who can also LOS, or he'll use one of his other abilities, then try to select a new target afterwards. Those abilities are a Tank Buster that has a bleed attached to it, and a Shout that will deal damage to everyone and fear anyone not near an ally. Funnily enough, this last ability can also be LOS, so if you're able to get this mini-boss near a wall, you can essentially trivialize most of his abilities. I should note again that this is on PTR, so there's a chance that this doesn't make it live, but as of now, this is a strategy that you can use. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Anima Powers drop depend both on the Lieutenant and what your role is. There is no randomness at all currently in these powers, so for example, if you're a DPS player, every time you kill Incinerator Arcalith, he will always offer the exact same 3 powers, no matter what dungeon you kill him in, no matter what week it is. In terms of Anima Powers themselves, they're a bit of a mixed bag, with some of them based on dungeon affixes, allowing you to turn them on enemies, some based on old general legendaries from Legion, as well as a general boost to your character. There are no class or spec specific Anima Powers in the pool, which I think is a good choice, since that could just turn into a terrible situation if one spec gets an insane power and another gets a near useless one. It's just a big mess, so definitely a good idea on Blizzard's part to make these power pools role specific rather than class or spec specific. I should also note that these Anima Powers currently scale with your attack power, spell power, and versatility, not with the key level, which I think again is another good decision. Otherwise, we could end up with another Zap bot situation, for those of you that remember Junkyard back in BFA, or for more recent examples, something like Plague Borers, but in every dungeon. So I'm happy with the decision to avoid that. In terms of power strength, again, remember the actual number tuning is changing all the time on the PTR, but once the season is actually released, I'll definitely be going in depth on power selection as well as rooting to pick them up quickly. Now let's go into the powers themselves, starting with Executioner Varuth, who is currently looking to provide some of the strongest powers for all 3 roles. For all roles, he offers Champion's Brand, which provides an 8% either haste or crit buff, whichever you have more of, as long as you remain above 70% HP, which even on high key levels you get a very good uptime on, and is really enticing for a lot of different specs if the other powers aren't great for you. For DPSers, he also offers variants of the Volcanic and Necrotic affixes, where Volcanic Plumage gives you a chance to spawn volcanoes beneath your target, dealing AoE damage and knocking them up, and Necrotic Wounding causes your damage to stack up a dot, and healing reduction up to 10 times for a 20% total reduction. For Volcanic, this extra CC is definitely interesting. I would say it's similar to Elemental Shaman's Earthquake, having a chance to knock enemies down, so it's a nice benefit, but not something you should be relying on. It also doesn't work on CC immune mobs, which makes sense, but tuning dependent, it should be a good AoE option. Necrotic, on the other hand, is likely to be better for pure single target damage, and while the 20% total healing reduction may seem low, it does stack with other people that have the Necrotic power, so if all 3 of your DPS grab it, you can add up to a 60% healing reduction, which is decent as it reduces healing from things like Sanguine, and also things like the Absorb Shield on Hakar, so could be quite good. For healers, aside from Champion's Brand, you can choose between giving your heals a chance to spawn orbs that you can pick up for 10% mana, or causing yourself to store 5% of your health per second in a heal that will go to the most injured player within 40 yards when you move. I could definitely see this last power being situationally very strong, but in general, I think stats are going to be best for healers not struggling on mana, with the orbs being very, very strong if you find yourself running into mana problems. Lastly, for tanks, Varuth provides a Thorns-like power, allowing you to deal shadow damage back to your attackers for 4% of your current health, meaning tanks with higher HP values will be able to dish out relatively more damage with this power, and big defensives like Meta and Incarnation that give you a sizable HP boost will also boost the damage from this trait, making it very strong. The other trait for tanks provides a stacking 6% damage increase every second while standing still. That is lost when you move, up to 18%. And it's another one that could situationally be pretty good. Definitely looks good on paper, but in practice I think there's a lot of smaller movements involved in tanking, so I'm not sure what the uptime is going to be on the higher stack counts. Meaning it's likely you're going to go for the more consistent Thorns damage or the stats if both of these powers have poor tuning. Incinerator Arcolith has a set of offensive powers for players of all roles to choose from, on top of giving them the option of picking up an additional Champions brand. This will stack if you picked up Champions brand from Varuth, up to 16% of whichever stat, so it can be very, very good if your class just likes pure stats. His DPS powers are takes on both Raging and Bolstering, with the former letting you stack up a 10% damage taken increase on targets below 30% HP, up to a total of 30% damage, and the latter granting you a 5% damage increase for 25 seconds when an enemy dies, stacking up to 5 times, though the duration does not get refreshed. In general, I think Bolstering is definitely super situational, getting a lot of value on things like boss fights that have ad spawns, such as like two bosses in Necrotic Wake, whereas Raging gets a lot of value on boss fights and even just bigger elite mobs in general. It's especially good for classes that already have strong execute damage. Healers get the choice of a flat 15% healing increase while above 90% health, which is good if a single player is taking heavy damage, but in any situation where heavy party damage is going out and it's dangerous enough to warrant this healing increase, the healer is likely going to be below that 90% threshold, right? So this power is actually quite weak in the majority of situations, I would say. For this to be relevant, I think the health threshold will need to be moved down a fair bit, or the healing increase needs a big boost, or both. The other power option is a play on Sanguine, causing heals to have a chance to radiate Ichor from yourself, healing allies and damaging up to 5 enemies within 12 yards. Again, this radiates from the healer themselves, so for you to get full value, you do kind of need to be close to melee, which isn't a big deal for some healers like Holy Paladin, like Mistweaver, who are used to being there, but it can take a little bit of adjustment for other healers to get good value. For tank powers, there's an AoE one that causes you to pulse for shadow damage if at least 5 enemies are within 10 yards of you, which is obviously great in 5+ target AoE and does absolutely nothing outside of that. So to get value, it'll vary from dungeon to dungeon. There's also a flat 5% verse buff that gives you a 40% DR for 3 seconds upon entering combat, which could be solid since the verse bonus is much more consistent than the haste or crit buff, but I think this 40% DR portion is definitely super lackluster, losing value if you're chain pulling, or if you pull from range, as it results in some if not all of the DR being lost as the mobs are running to you. In general, I think this power would be a lot better if the DR portion resembled something more like First Strike or the new Carver's Eye, giving you a 3-second DR when you hit either a new mob or like a mob above 90% health, or just something more similar to that, as opposed to just when you enter combat, because as is, that part of the effect is pretty much nothing. If you want to keep it the way it is, I think maybe a duration increase could potentially work, but it would probably need an additional like 2 or 3 seconds to even make it worthwhile. With Arcolith done, let's move on to Sagadan, who has an array of defensive powers for players to choose from. All players have access to the Stone Ward, which is yet another reincarnation of the Legion legendary Pridaz, and has great general value in pretty much every situation, providing a 20% max HP shield that refreshes every 45 seconds. If none of the other powers available are particularly good for your spec or the specific dungeon, this is going to be a solid go-to for literally everyone. The other powers available to DPS players are a 5 to 25% leech buff depending on health, and the ability to dodge to melee or ranged attacks against you when entering combat. In terms of usability, the dodge one sounds interesting and definitely like something that could be used for some serious cheese, but it'll take some figuring out and will likely be extremely niche. From there, I think it's a bit of a toss-up where if you're not expecting on taking too many big hits, or you're expecting to take multiple big hits inside of 45-second windows, the leech power could definitely pull ahead. But otherwise, something like Pridaz, the power could just save your life from a single big hit every 45-ish seconds or more. Also, how well your spec interacts with Leech could be a factor, but both certainly have value. Healers have a couple similar powers, also having access to the Absorb Shield and the Dodge powers, in addition to a power that increases self-healing by 75%. Like the dodge ability, this power will probably be quite niche, and I think just having the Absorb Shield in most cases is going to be the better option for healers, again, unless there's some sort of cheese to be had. Tanks again, a couple repeat powers as well, this time the Absorb Shield and the Leech powers, alongside a flat 25% magic damage reduction. That's a very big number. The choice here is probably going to depend on a couple things. First, the dungeon you're in, as the magic damage intake can vary quite a bit from dungeon to dungeon, and second, how far in the dungeon you get this power, right? If you get it pretty early on, you can get a ton of value from it, but if you get it late in a dungeon and all the dangerous magic damage is already behind you, you're likely better off taking some of the other choices, right? Again, I think this is generally, the Absorb Shield is going to be the best option if you can't get good use of this magic damage reduction, but Leech is also very good for tanks, and giving you more Leech the lower your health is a pretty nice benefit to have, providing some help when you need it the most. Last up, we have Oros Coldheart, who has a mixed bag of defensive, utility, and low damage increase powers. DPSers have access to a self-debuff dispel every 20 seconds, an 8-second long 10% damage increase to targets you interrupt, or a 3-second move speed increase and damage reduction when taking more than 25% of your health in a single hit. While this technically is two defensive powers competing with a DPS power, it's important to note that this DPS increase is very, very small, and in best case scenarios, which is a shaman, it's a 66% uptime on just a single target, assuming you're able to use your kick on CD, which often isn't the case. If we look at the Dispel power, it's definitely hit and miss depending on the dungeon. A great example of it being very, very strong is in Plaguefall against Margrave Stradama, where you can get rid of that scary disease. And an example of it being terrible is Nalthor in Necrotic Wake, where if you have an unfortunate timing of auto-dispelling yourself right when the root goes out, you could just potentially wipe your group. Basically, it's just another niche talent that has potential to save your life or even kill your friends. The defensive boost after taking 25% of your health could be decent if you're ever taking several big hits in quick succession. However, usually if a DPSer is taking 25% of their HP in a hit, they either have aggro and are dying soon regardless of what happens, or they just took a big hit from a mechanic and are likely going to be safe in the seconds following, causing this trait to lose a lot of value. I could see it being good in very specific cases, maybe something like Grand Proctor Borrelia, but I think there's many more examples of bosses where that second scenario I mentioned happens, and as a result, the trait's not really helping you very much. Basically, unless you absolutely need this power to survive a specific boss, which very well could be the case on very high key levels, especially for tyrannical keys, I think you're likely going to go somewhere else. For healers, there's a few interesting powers. One, giving your autos a 5-second stun on a 30-second CD. One that lets you eat and drink food faster, essentially turning any water you drink into the old fish feast players used to chug through in Mythic Plus. And the last giving you a 20-yard, 30% move speed aura for you and your allies. Despite some solid choices here, I honestly think the move speed aura is just too strong to give up, providing a ton of group utility, whether it be for kiting mobs, dodging swirlies, or just helping you do mechanics faster. It's just extremely powerful utility that you will 100% notice when you don't have it. The tank powers also have some solid options with a 15% AoE DR for allies within 10 yards, a 4-second silence when first hitting a target, and the same interrupt damage power that DPS have. I could see this damage power being very, very good for prot paladins in particular, thanks to the insane amount of interrupts they can pump out, but in general, that 15% AoE DR can provide an absolute ton of value if your party is able to stay near you when big damage hits are going out. Outside of that, the silence is niche, but can be quite good dealing with things like ads that cast on being spawned, like Mordretha and Theater of Pain, or even just grouping up packs that have multiple casters in it, as you can do that easily without needing to coordinate multiple different kicks. Dungeon dependent, I could see it being a very strong choice. So, how does this affix actually play out, and how does it compare to the previous seasonal affix, Prideful? It's likely that in most dungeons, you want to try and pick up as many offensive powers as you can early on in the run, then doing bigger pulls once you have that strength behind you. This makes something like Rogue Shroud or Invispot usage quite valuable, allowing you to skip over trash to get your powers quicker. When it comes to routing, the removal of Prideful I think opens it up a lot, since you no longer need to worry about your trash percentage as you go through the dungeon, which allows you to do things like bigger pulls, maybe higher efficiency pulls in different points of the dungeon that you would otherwise had to skip out on because of Prideful percents, and in general just probably less backtracking, which again was done to line up Pridefuls for certain encounters. Overall, this is definitely a positive thing going into the season, and I think we're going to see a lot of new routes developed in most dungeons because of it. In terms of concerns I think scaling on the mini-bosses is going to be the biggest problem in higher keys, and unlike prideful mobs, I think in most situations you're not going to be able to skip any of the more difficult lieutenants, as it just makes the final boss nearly unkillable on higher key levels. Aside from scaling, there's also big variance between dungeons on how quickly you actually get your powers, which I think needs to be made a little bit more consistent. For example, in a dungeon like Theater of Pain, after killing the first boss, it's actually possible to then pull 3 lieutenants back to back to back, and then have 3 out of your 4 Anima Powers before even pulling a single trash mob. On the other hand, a dungeon like Spires of Ascension gives you access to only 1 power early on, which you have to do then 60 to 70% of the dungeon trash with before getting to your next lieutenant over on the second boss's platform. Obviously, some variance from dungeon to dungeon is perfectly fine, but I think currently there's just a few dungeons that need an adjustment on where the lieutenants are positioned, so you actually get to use them for the majority of the dungeon. Outside of that, I have a minor issue on power acquisition, as currently you have to kill the lieutenant, who drops an orb that you have to run over to and interact with, channel on for 2 seconds, which will then spawn another orb underneath you that you can then click on to have the powers show up on your screen. Sounds like a lot of steps, right? This wastes a bunch of time whenever you need to pick up a power, and I think a nice little quality of life change for this affix could be to have the power choice kind of appear as a little "you have a power selection waiting" note that happens, if you remember, in Torghast. Players can just kind of click on that note to bring up the power choice menu. No channeling, no needing to get into range of the now dead mini boss. That would just be a lot better in my opinion. Overall, though, I think this new Affix is going to be a great change of pace for Mythic Plus. Despite early concerns on there being a lot of RNG, I think Blizzard has done very well to address these potential problems and put out another solid seasonal Affix. That does conclude this video, though, guys. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on the new Tormented Affix. Do you think it's good? How do you think it stacks up against Prideful? Let me know down in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I'll be putting out simple and advanced routes out fairly soon, as well as an updated KSM guide series and high-key tank commentary videos, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to be notified when those are released. That's it for me, though. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.